Welcome, welcome. We made it to Friday. It's September the 19th. This is Hurricane Hub Live. I'm Chief Meteorologist Tim Pandages. Tonight on HHL, got an update for you on Tropical Storm Gabrielle out there in the Atlantic. It has been struggling. The Atlantic overall has been one of the most hostile basins in years. You know, actually in decades for this time of the peak of the season to have such a hostile Atlantic. Very, very unusual. But Gabrielle is getting its act together. You'll see it on satellite imagery. It looks a whole lot better than it did just 24 hours ago. We're also monitoring one other wave in the far eastern Atlantic. This one still remains with a low chance, a low probability of developing into the next named storm. And the eastern Pacific remains active, although no named storms at the moment, but two areas of interest, one moderate, one high chance of developing over the next 7 days or so. So far, the Atlantic season has been underwhelming with the exception of Erin. Thankfully, that stayed offshore. Of course, there was a Category 5 and captured our attention for like 10 days. It was around for a long time, developed off the coast of Africa, and then slowly but surely moved along and threaded the needle between Bermuda and the Atlantic East Coast. That's been kind of the trend, recurving out to sea, with the exception being Chantal, the only landfalling storm. Hopefully that's going to be the only landfalling storm in the U.S. this season. It made landfall as a tropical storm in July along the South Carolina coastline. And then we did have another landfall in Mexico, though, and that was Barry earlier, just right before Chantal in July as well, late June, early July. And then the rest of the storms have been recurving out to sea. And then here's our newest addition. This is Gabrielle, currently a low-grade tropical storm, and will remain likely that until it moves into a more favorable window for development, which is likely this weekend. We expect it to become at least a Category 1 hurricane. Forecast now goes up to a Cat 2. It could even overperform. We'll see. If it gets a pocket of favorable conditions for a prolonged period of time, that could certainly be the case. All right, here it is on satellite imagery. This is infrared, and we can see that yesterday, if we go back, it'll go back a little bit, but yesterday it was really combating some very strong west to southwest wind shear that was kind of displacing all the convection off to the northeast center of Gabrielle. Now we're beginning to see the convection flare up and start to wrap around that core. And you can see the stronger convection here because we're looking at the temperatures of the cloud tops with this infrared satellite imagery. Colder the cloud tops, the stronger the thunderstorms. And when we see the shades of white here, those are very cold cloud tops, meaning very intense thunderstorm activity. So it is showing signs of getting its act together, organizing, despite still ongoing wind shear. It's tapped down a little bit, but there's still wind shear being imparted on the system, and it's going to be drifting out of that and likely seeing a burst of intensification here probably by tomorrow night. Here's a look at it on visible satellite imagery. You can see the wind shear, especially in the first couple of frames, the exposed low-level center still there. But then the central dense overcast, thanks to the strong convection, begins to kind of cover on up and almost give it a milky hue, covering up that low-level circulation there, meaning that we're starting to see it line up and build vertically. And it's almost got that kind of look, that large circulation as it's moving to the west-northwest at 12, which is a pretty average speed for a tropical system. It's just fast enough, but just slow enough to take advantage of the warm ocean waters as well. Winds right now 50 miles per hour. Now, what was a problem yesterday on top of the wind shear has been the entrainment of dry air, that dry air getting sucked into the circulation and kind of sputtering it along. There's still plenty of dry air lurking pretty much all around it. But for now, we can see that it's kind of walled itself off from any of that dry air getting entrained into the system. But as it builds to the west-northwest, yeah, there's some pockets of some dry air here in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. Not so much dust anymore. It's just overall stability in the Atlantic Basin right now. A lot of sinking motion, not so much right in the immediate vicinity of where Gabrielle is, obviously, because we've got the rising motion and convection, but there is plenty of stability out there in the basin that's preventing much else from really developing in the short term. All right, here's the new forecast track as of 5 o'clock from the National Hurricane Center. Again, tomorrow we're up to 65-mile-per-hour winds, up from 50 right now. And then we jump to Cat 1 hurricane status by Sunday afternoon, and then up to a Cat 2, maybe stronger. We'll see if it overperforms. 105-mile-per-hour winds looks to be where it peaks in intensity here as of this forecast advisory. But thankfully, it steers clear of all land. It is a far eastern track compared to where Erin was. Erin, of course, was a little bit farther to the west in between Bermuda and the East Coast. But there's Bermuda right there. And it looks to track the cone is now clearly east of Bermuda. So even if it does see any impacts, it's going to be on the clean side of the storm on the western side. And probably some breezy conditions, certainly some rough surf. But in terms of direct impacts from the storm hitting Bermuda right now, looks less and less likely, which is great news. So it'll be likely another storm out to sea, a recurving storm. That's been kind of the theme so far this season. All right, modeling in very good agreement here. A few models on the far western side of the cone, but even that is still clear well to the east of Bermuda. So good news there in terms of the forecast model front. Now, when we compare the operational runs of the American GFS and the European going out in time, there is Bermuda right there. Both storms do vary a little bit east to west. European is a little farther west, GFS a little farther to the east. GFS indicating a stronger storm, so likely a recurve happening earlier, meaning it's farther to the east. European maybe is a little bit behind in terms of how fast it intensifies, taking it a little bit, just a tad bit farther to the west, but still the center at least steering well to the east of Bermuda, and then it heads out into the North Atlantic, maybe heading towards the Azores or even off towards northern portions of Europe. I mean, it's happened before. It could certainly keep together. Likely that time would be a post-tropical or extratropical storm. But elsewhere in the Atlantic basin, we've got this wave that's now about 24 hours off the coast of Africa, just south of the Cabo Verde Islands. 20% chance of this developing over the next 7 days. Models don't do a whole lot with this. So again, still a hostile environment here, a lot of widespread sinking motion, stability. So we'll watch it. I mean, right now it's a large tropical wave, and this time of year they are usually pretty robust coming off the African coastline there. But if they're not moving into a very fertile environment, they just peter on out. That we've seen happen numerous times already this season. Now out in the Atlantic basin, actually this is the Eastern Pacific. It's a new update here. This is yesterday, if you remember this, which is a tropical wave that looks quite healthy, was tagged at 80% probability of developing. Now it's down below 30%. So it has drastically dropped in terms of probability of this becoming another named Storm Narda, which is the next name on the list in the Eastern Pacific. However, another wave behind it now has a high chance of getting that name. But this kind of gives us an indication where this is building, that more stability is likely around, or a more hostile environment, which is an indication that the highly active Eastern Pacific may be heading into a quieter period. And typically when we see the Eastern Pacific quiet down, it tends to lead to a little bit more of an uptick in activity in the Atlantic and vice versa, which is why the Atlantic has been so quiet and the Eastern Pacific has been so active. We're at 13 named storms now. Well, Narda would be the 13th so far this season. So a lot of activity out there. All right, folks, that's the latest on the tropics. Coming up after a quick break, we're going to do tropical trivia, and we've also got some packages to share with you, some stories to share with you when I see you after a quick break. Welcome back to Hurricane Hub Live. Have you been listening to your local meteorologist this hurricane season and wondered why most 2025 tropical systems have curved out to sea? Well, here's meteorologist Evan Stewart explaining the Azores high.
Overall, the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season hasn't been very active. We've had just one hurricane, Erin. Tropical Storm Gabrielle is currently in the Atlantic, but is forecast to curve back out to sea, keeping it away from the United States. And that's like the path of many of this year's named storms. Why have a majority of this year's tropical systems stayed away from the United States? Well, each storm's eventual path is influenced by a lot of different factors. But one primary influence this year has been something called the Azores high. Now, the Azores high is one phase of this semi-permanent high-pressure ridge that typically sets up over the Atlantic Ocean. That's one phase. The other one you might have heard of before, that's the Bermuda high. And the high-pressure ridge expands and contracts throughout the year between those two phases. And its circulation plays a major role in steering tropical systems. When the ridge expands, it's in the Bermuda high phase. That's the stronger phase, and it stretches across more of the Atlantic, so far that it sometimes reaches the East Coast and the Gulf, and this brings storms closer to the United States. When the ridge contracts, it's in the Azores high phase, which allows tropical systems to turn to the north a little bit sooner, something we've seen with many of the systems this season. Although the Azores high has spared coastal communities so far this year, this pattern could shift, and storms later in the season could find a more favorable track towards land.
All right, the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season has passed, with only one storm, a tropical storm Chantal, making landfall in the U.S. Of course, Tropical Storm Gabrielle is churning, but it's not expected to directly impact the United States. CNN correspondent Lee Waldman spoke with experts at the National Hurricane Center. Let's hear what they have to say.
The National Hurricane Center doesn't want people who are in the typical paths of hurricanes here in the U.S. to think that they're out of the woods for the season just yet. Last year, the most devastating storms came at the end of September and early October.
We're predicting an above average season once again, 2025 above average.
Despite that ominous warning ahead of the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season, the United States has avoided landfall from a hurricane so far.
Overall, the activity is at this point lagging sort of climatology a little bit by a couple of named storms and 2 or 3 hurricanes.
Earlier this week, Tropical Storm Gabrielle formed in the central Atlantic Ocean, ending an unusual nearly 3-week stretch with no storms during the peak of hurricane season. It's been a quiet September so far, but director of the National Hurricane Center, Michael Brennan, says we shouldn't let our guard down just yet.
As we get into late September and that focus for activity really does shift farther west, closer to home, which can mean if we have storms form in those areas, they're much more likely to affect land.
Brennan says storms can also form and strengthen in a very short period of time. He reminds people to look at last year as an example with Hurricanes Helene and Milton. Those storms made landfall in late September and early October, respectively.
We had a lot of these similar discussions in 2024. There was a very quiet period in August into early September. And then we got really, really busy and late in the season.
The Atlantic hurricane season ends in November. Brennan urges people to stay alert.
If you have another storm form nearby and make landfall within 3 or 4 days, you don't have a lot of time to get ready. And that's why it's so important to have that hurricane plan in place now.
Brennan reminds people that just because a storm doesn't make a U.S. landfall doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Hurricane Erin in August made dangerous rip currents and big waves, despite the eye of that storm being hundreds of miles off of the East Coast. In New York, I'm Lee Waldman.
All right, time for tropical trivia. Last night's question was, what was the longest-lived named storm in the Atlantic Basin? Irma, Jose, Ginger, or Erin? 3 of 4 of those were recent in the last 5 seasons, but the correct answer is Ginger. And that storm was around for 27 1/4 days as a named storm. It did make landfall in North Carolina. That was back in 1971. Ginger. All right, that's the latest on the tropics, folks. We appreciate you joining us here on Hurricane Hub Live. Remember, we are here every day, 7 days a week at 8 p.m. for the latest update on the tropics. We'll see you back here tomorrow night.